Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Hayden Falzon from falzonfantasy.com, and today we are going to be learning how to make a Samsung Galaxy S8 in Blender 2.8. I hope you enjoy. Upon loading Blender up, we are going to want to bring up our Properties tool shelf of our object on the right hand side of the screen. To do this, we're going to press N. All of your object's transformational properties will be found in this toolbar. The one that we are going to be interested in initially is the dimensions. The Y value is going to be the length of our phone. We are going to change the Y value to a value of 148.9 millimeters. Inputting our value as a millimeter will automatically convert into a meter value. The X dimension will be the width of our phone, and the X value that we'll be inputting is 68.1 millimeters. The last value that we'll be inputting is the Z dimension, as a 2 meter thick smartphone is not going to be very wieldy in one's pocket. This we are going to set to 8 millimeters. We have now scaled our cube to the dimensions of a modern day smartphone. You may have noticed that our transformational scale value has changed to reflect the dimensional changes that we have made. We are going to want to change all these scale values back to 1. To do this, we're going to press Ctrl A, which will bring up an Apply menu, and then we're going to apply the scale. Now you should see that all of our values have returned back to 1. The reason that we do this is that it will make our life a lot easier when we apply modifiers to our model. Some modifiers will require the scale to be at a 1 value in order to be applied correctly. The same can also be said for location and rotational values. The next step is that we're going to want to apply a bevel to the corners of this rectangle. By pressing Tab, we're going to enter Edit mode, which we can then manipulate faces, edges, and vertices. So what we are going to want to do is we want to select all 4 edges that make up the corners of our rectangle. We can do this by selecting all of the vertices. We can also do this by selecting the edges in Edge Select mode, or alternatively, I will show you another way, which I think you will find most useful. First, we're going to change our edit to make sure that we can only edit our edges. That's by pressing that button there. And then to select all of the edges, we're going to press Ctrl, Alt, and then we're going to select one edge. And what that's going to do is going to select all the edges within that loop. Excellent. Now, going into top orthographic mode, we're then going to press Ctrl and B, and that's going to give us our bevel options. So we want to bevel it to a value of around 0.01. And then by scrolling up on the mouse wheel, we'll be able to change how many segments that our bevel operation is going to calculate for. In my model, I created 5 segments for my bevel on the corners. Next, we're going to create a loop that runs along the edge of our phone. This is going to be made up of 2 loop cuts, so we're going to press Ctrl R with our cursor hovering over where we wish to place the loop. And then we're going to scroll up so that we are cutting it into 2 segments. We're then going to press our left mouse button to activate it, and then we're going to straight away, without pressing anything, press our right mouse button, which will set that where it is. Okay, now I'm going to show you what we can do to make our life a little easier. Now, we could have done this at the beginning while it was still a cube, but because I feel that this will be a good opportunity to highlight how good the knife tool is, I'm going to be doing it now. Also, it's because I forgot to do it. We are going to create 2 horizontal loop cuts on either side of this because it won't be able to cross over the large face in the center because we've beveled it. So in order to cross over, we're going to press K to bring up our knife tool. Then we're going to essentially cut our model in 2. We can constrain the line that we're creating by pressing C, which will constrain the angle to 45 degrees. We're then going to bring our edge and just connect it up to there. When we are happy with the position of the second vertex, we're going to hit the left mouse button. After that, we're going to press Enter. which is going to lock our edge into place. Next, we're going to do this for the other side, so the same exact steps. After we have done this, we should have a loop cut that goes down the entire middle of our object. We are then going to go into our right orthographic mode, press Z to bring up our wireframe mode, and then we're going to deselect everything, and then we're going to use our box select just to select the vertices on one side, and then we're going to delete them. So this is going to leave us with half an object. What we are then going to do is we're going to come into our modifiers tab and we're going to add a modifier. We're going to add a mirror modifier. Now, right away, you're going to see nothing because the mirror modifier right now is mirroring an axis that we don't need to mirror at the moment. So as you can see, the axis that we need to mirror is going to be the y-axis, because the y-axis is the one that's pointing down our model. So we can turn off the X and turn on the Y. We're then going to, in the options panel, check the clipping option, which is going to ensure that our vertices do not separate when we're modeling them. So this is without the clipping on. So as you can see, they can pass through one another and they're not really constrained to the center. But with clipping on, they are merged together and they act as a single vertex. Because we are working on such a small scale, it is going to be beneficial for us to change the clip start and clip end values. These values can be found on our right menu here, and below the clip start is the end. Just think of it as clip end. And what the clip start does is, as you can see, when I'm in perspective mode, we can't really see much of the model. But if I change the value to be smaller, it changed the clipping of our object so we could see all of it instead of being clipped. If you have a really small clip start, we're going to make sure that the end is also relatively smaller. So I set the clip end to around 100 meters in this instance. In animation, these two values become supremely important, so please keep them in mind, especially if your animations have artifacting or flickering. Okay, now that's done, we should have a fairly good view on our object now when we're zooming in and out. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to split up our object further into another quadrant. So we're going to do the exact same steps that we did for across our object, but we're just going to do it now vertically. So we're going to be using our loop cut, and then we're going to do 2 slices with the knife tool. Now, like before, in wireframe mode, we're going to delete one side of our mesh, and then we're going to turn on our new axis that will essentially make our base mesh full again. So instead of having to edit all the sides individually, we just have to edit now one corner, which is very, very beneficial. And those changes will be reflected on all corners. Our next step is to select the face in the center of our model and just scale it up on the Z-axis. But before we do that, I would like to point out that we are going to want to make sure that the vertices on the beveled edge, we want to sort of lead up into that new level that we're going to create. So to do this, what we're going to do is use proportional editing. To make sure nothing else is selected, we're going to use our loop select tool, so Alt and Shift to select multiple loops, and then hide it by pressing the H key. So we're only going to be left with the loop in the center. So that means that all the other vertices are not going to be able to be edited by the proportional editing, which we can activate by pressing O. Now we can reselect our faces that we're going to be scaling up on the Z-axis. And then we're just going to scale just ever so slightly, and we can use the mouse wheel to control the area of effect of the proportional editing. And because it's not really the right type of curve, we can change the curve type in this drop-down menu here. So I'm going to change it to a sharp curve, and that's just going to make sure that our fall-off is a bit more sharp so that the edge is concave when it curves up to meet that new level. Okay, while in edit mode, we can press Alt-H to bring everything that was hidden back. Now we're going to select the 2 loops on the outside of our phone surface. Then we want to go into a view where we're facing down our phone. And then we're going to press G for grab, and then X to constrain it on the X axis. And we're just going to drag those points in. With our loop still selected, we're going to go into the top orthographic view, and then we're going to drag them downwards. So G for grab again, and then Y to constrain them on the Y axis. And then we're going to drag them ever so slightly down, less than what we drag them while dragging them on the X axis. Next, we can press A to deselect everything, and then we're going to select the two loops in the center. Next, we're going to press Ctrl B to bevel our edges, but we want to make sure that there is a gap between the two lower edges so there's no intersection, because we don't want there to be any overlapping vertices. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the surface smooths and tapers up into the touch surface of the screen. To do that, we're going to make a loop cut in between these loops here. And we're just going to make sure that that's set to the default position. We are then going to deselect these vertices right here. We can do that by pressing Shift and then pressing the select button. Then we're going to switch to our front orthographic so we can see it from the side. And we're going to bring it down on the Z axis ever so much. We're then going to create another loop cut just above that. And we're going to do the same thing. So let's just select these two vertices here. And then we're going to go to our front orthographic, G and Z to constrain it on the Z. And we're just going to fiddle around with these vertices just until we get that nice curve in the form. So we want it to curve right into the screen. And then we're just going to do one more loop cut. So getting a lot of geometry. And we're just going to very subtly, you can do as many as you want really. It's all up to you. It's about what looks good to you. Next, we're going to grab our loop here and we're going to just do a very slight bevel with one segment. Now I'm just going to do a very little quick cleanup, just moving a few vertices here and there. Our next step is that we want to mirror the bottom to the top now. So we're going to create a new loop cut right in between all of that. And we're going to use our box select tool with our wireframe mode on, and we're just going to now delete those vertices. And what it should look like, we've split our phone right in half. And then we're just going to turn on the Z axis in our mirror modifier for our object. Now our changes should be applied to both the top and the bottom, and we've also further limited the scope that we're going to have to work on, which is good for us. The next step is that we're going to want to create the metallic border. To do this, we're going to select a few of these loops here. We're then going to press Ctrl and D to duplicate the vertices that we've selected, and then we're going to press P, which is going to bring up a separate menu, and we're going to separate by selection. So now we're going to be left with this essentially a separator in the middle of our phone. And this is going to be our metallic band that wraps around our phone. Now with this new object, the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to add a new solidify modifier just beneath the mirror modifier. And we're going to want to set the thickness of this to something very, very small. So I'm going to set mine to -0.0001. Now for visualization purposes, I'm going to set both my objects to be smooth shaded, so W and then shade smooth. Now we're going to want to tweak the band around the phone just a little bit. So we're going to go into edit mode and we're going to bring up the top and bottom part. Well, because we're only working with mirror modifier activated, it's going to reflect those changes on both sides. We want to bring it up to around where the screen becomes flat. To make sure that my vertices are always on top, I'm going to enable snapping to surface. So I'm going to enable snapping, and then I'm going to set the snapping from increment to face. So what that means is that the vertices will be snapped to the closest face. If you need to, grab a picture off the internet and use that as your reference. It's always really important to have a reference when modeling these sort of things, and we're doing a rather rough job of it at the moment, but right now I'm using my phone as a reference. So in this stage, all that we're really doing is we're pulling and stretching and just moving the vertices until we get to a point where we really like the shape of it. you can really just let your imagination go, well, somewhat wild. You are like constrained to what the object is, but you don't have to make it exactly to the blueprint. Our next step is that we want to create all the little details on our phone, such as the microphone as well as the headphone jack and charger port. To do this, we're going to use a Boolean operation. Now, please don't do what I do and do not apply the mirror modifier. Just make sure that your Booleans come after your mirror modifier, as applying a mirror modifier just created too many headaches for me in this build because I was silly and didn't check the merge limit. But for reference, if you're working on a small scale, make sure that your merge limit is of a proportionate smaller scale. Now, to begin our Boolean operations, the first thing that we're going to want to do is to create primitives. Primitives that we will end up turning into shapes that we'll use to cut our geometry to create our ports and other miscellaneous holes. So the first one I'm going to start with is a cube. I'm then going to drag the cube down on the Y to roughly where the charger port is. So this cube is going to become the charger port. And you want to scale it till around about here. It's about 1/3 the thickness of the entire phone. Like 2D stencils, we're going to want to think of this shape as a 3D negative space. So that's what we're going to create. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to split up my object and mirror it, and then create a bevel, because the Samsung S8 uses a USB-C type charger port, and that's a much more rounded edge. Also, before you bevel, please remember to apply the scale. Now that we've created our negative shape, I'm just going to scale it on the Y-axis just a little bit so we got more object to work with. And then I'm going to move it so that it intersects both my silver metallic object and the actual phone itself. Now, before we apply any of the Boolean operations, it would be a good idea to duplicate the geometry that we've already got and then to put it into a new collection, just in case something goes wrong. So I'm going to duplicate my geometry by selecting and pressing Ctrl D, and then I'm going to move it to a new collection by pressing M for move, and I'm just going to name that collection bin, and then I can turn the render off and the visibility off, so we won't see that collection anymore, but it will all be in there. And this is just a really good way of making sure that your progress isn't destroyed if, for example, you run out of undos. Now, with our phone base selected, we're going to go into our Modifiers tab, add a Boolean, and we're going to set the Boolean operation to difference and select our cube that we just created. And we're also going to do that for the metal edge. So Boolean, select the object that we want to cut away from the object, and then we're going to go and set the operation to difference. We also want to put that above the solidify, so above the solidify but below the mirror operation if you still have a mirror. So that we are able to see our Boolean operation in effect, we're going to go to our Object Data tab, and then we're going to set our viewport display and display as bounds. We've got a really great Boolean operation going on here, but there's a few errors with the smooth shading, and we can fix that by just creating a new modifier, an edge split modifier, which should sort out all the normal issues there. Now I'm going to create the headphone jack port by creating a cylinder primitive object first, and then we're going to do the exact same steps that we just did. So we're going to firstly create the negative space sort of silhouette in 3D. Then we're going to apply a Boolean operation to both the screen and the metal edge. We can also set our Boolean objects to smooth shade it. And then after that, we're going to set our object to display as bounds only, so that we're able to see the Boolean operation in effect. On our phones, there are three very, very small holes. 1 on the bottom and 2 on top. And for those, we're just going to duplicate our already pre-made circular Boolean, and we're just going to put it exactly where those holes are. So remember, 1 on top and 1 on the bottom. So the 1 on the bottom is kind of halfway, like it's on just at the edge of where the top of the charger port is, round about there. Next, create the grates on the bottom of the phone. I'm just going to grab my charger port and I'm going to duplicate it. Then I'm going to rotate it on the y-axis, and then I'm going to move it into place. After we have scaled down this object until it's quite small, so roughly this big, we're then going to go into our Object Modifiers tab and we're going to add a new array modifier. We're then going to change the array relative offset so that it is being arrayed by twice its relative width across. And we are going to set the count to 5. Now, if your object is too tall or too short, what we're going to do is going to go into edit mode and press G, and then we're going to move it on the axis that we want to scale it by. So we're not going to be pressing scale, so S, because if we do that, it's going to squash all of our geometry. The only reason that we can do it this way is because we've got a mirror modifier applied with clipping, which means that the object will just clip into itself and in effect look like we're scaling it on that axis. And what you just saw me do just there is I press copy on one of the modifiers, or the Boolean modifiers, and then I'm just going to change the source object that is going to be used to cut out from our phone. Now, if no holes are appearing, a very easy thing that we can do is just slightly move our object until we're getting all the holes. So because I'm using wireframe mode on this one, or in your case you might be using a different one like bounds, we're able to see when the holes are actually generated. And this is just a very quick and easy fix if they're not appearing. Now for the final detail that's going to require Boolean, we're going to duplicate that cylinder now, and we're going to just bring it up to the top and then duplicate it again. And this is, you know, a good rough estimate as to where these holes are. So I'm just going to, again, copy my last Boolean, and then I'm just going to assign the source object to one of these new cylinders, and I'm going to do that 2 times. The next steps that I'm going to take is that I'm going to model the camera and the sensor that is going to be on the back surface of the phone. Because my 3D cursor is out of whack, I'm just going to place it back at the origin, and then I'm going to create a plane. I'm just going to scale that down, then lift it up so that it's just above the surface. It can be pretty far off because we're going to be using a modifier that's just going to stick it right onto the surface like a decal. And you want to, you know, use references and kind of get it to the right sort of size and position. Then after that, we're going to want to apply our scale, because if we don't, as you can see, that's how far you have to pull out in order for the bevel to be applied. So remember, apply your scale. Now, if we go back into edit mode and Control B, it is very reactive now. But before we do that, I'm just going to duplicate this plane and just scale it slightly on the width way. So in this case, it's my x-axis, and then scale it down height way, so y-axis. Just very slightly on the height though. And this is going to be our sensor. With your cursor over one of the objects, we're going to press L to select that individual object, and then we're going to bevel it individually because they're going to have different bevel weights essentially. So hover over it, L to select, and just bevel the sensor to be a bit more curved like this. Okay, so this is going to be the basic shapes of our camera and our sensor. And they're effectively very similar in terms of geometry, except they do have a bit of differing materials, and that's about it. Then I'm going to go into Edge Select mode. Then I'm going to navigate up to my Edge drop-down menu and select Extrude Edges. Then I'm going to press S and Shift Z to constrain it to the axes other than the Z axis. And then we're going to type in 1.05 to scale it by 1.05 times. We do this so that we're able to replicate the exact same scale on the other object. So L, Edge, Extrude Edges, then Scale, S, then Shift Z to constrain, and then 1.05. Now with this object, because it's a bit squashed, we're just going to bring it out just ever so slightly on the X. So Scale and then press the X to constrain it on the X. Next, we want to create a loop cut in the center of the loop that runs around both of those objects. So we're left with 3 loops on the side. Then we're going to select the center one by pressing Shift Alt. And then we're going to drag them both up on the Z axis. I'm then going to press W and Shade Smooth. And then I'm going to apply an Edge Split modifier. And this will give our object a more naturalistic look. Now there are a couple of ways of applying this mesh to the surface. One way would be through modifiers and constraints, but just a real simple way is just to drag it down. So grab and then Z, and we'll drag it down to just be above the surface. I know, super cheap cop out, but goodness, it was just the most easy way to do it. Now, if you wanted to be a bit more complicated, we could go into constraints and modifiers to get it there, and so it's always going to be on the surface. But just to keep this simple, we're just going to transform it manually. And there we have it. We have our camera and our sensor on the surface. So, fairly simple. Now we're going to go back to edit mode with our edge selected, so our edge object selected, and then I'm going to create a new loop cut, and then I'm going to scale it, and then on its X and -1, make it straight. So we'll do that again, scale X -1, and that's just a really good way of making edges straight indeterminate to the axis. And we're going to make this, essentially these are going to be the geometry that's going to drive the lights that are on our phone. And because I made them like to a proportionate size, I'm just going to have to move the circle out to the side so it's not covering it up. And I'm just going to check that, because I got the mirror modifier activated, I'm just going to check that nothing was changed, and it was. So I'm going to have to move my grates a little bit. And there we go. So now we've got the geometry so we can easily put our material in, because those points there are going to be the lights on our phone. Okay, now we're going to go into our shading tab at the top, because we're going to move on to materials. The main materials that we're going to have to make is 2 screen materials, so one for the outer edge and one for the inside screen, so the touch screen. We're going to make a metallic edge material, a light material, and then we're also going to make our color back surface material. So the default material I've renamed base metal, and then we're just going to delete the principled BSDF, and we're going to create a glossy shader. So glossy BSDF, we're going to put the BSDF into the surface input of our material output, and then we're just going to decrease the roughness value to something quite small. You know, you have full reign of creative freedom here. Next, with our phone object selected, I'm going to go into the material tab, create a new material, and we're going to rename this material to, well, base color. And then I'm just going to put that above the base metal, and then I'm going to select all of my phone and assign the base color. So now we should see that the band around our phone is left as the base metal material, but our phone is now a different material altogether because we went into edit mode and we selected the vertices that we wanted to assign to that material, and then we assigned the material. Next, I'm going to go into my camera object and we're going to select the edges. So we can just grab those edges. So Shift Alt to select an edge loop, and then we're just going to select multiple edge loops. It is probably easier to do this in face select mode. And then we're just going to go and we're going to basically assign the base color, and then we're going to add a new material, base metal, and then we'll assign the base metal. So the base metal is like the material that's already on the edge. So we don't have to create a new material. All that we're doing is we're going to the material drop-down menu and selecting new. And the good thing about this now is if we update our material anywhere on the phone, it will update all the objects that call on that material. So it just means we got a lot of flexibility. In the base color material, I'm just going to change the metallic value to be something along the lines of 0.75, just to give it that nice little bit of sheen. So that looks fairly good for now. I think it's looking pretty naturalistic. So now we're just going to work on the screen. So we're going to create a new material, and we're going to call this base screen. And we're going to now assign that material. So we go into edit mode, and we're going to select the faces that we want to assign to the base screen material, and we're going to press assign. And then we can just change the color to be black. Then we're going to up the metallic value of our screen. So make it, make it pretty high. So around 0.9, around 0.95, around that number. Okay, now we're going to select the edge of our phone. So this is going to be the screen edge. So the screen edge is a little bit of a different color because it's actually got different properties. So to do this, we're just going to essentially, we want it to come down to be hidden by the metal. So we're going to create a new material, and we're going to call this material screen border. An easy way to select this would be to select the faces on top, then Control numpad plus, and that's just going to increase our selection by a factor of 1 each time we press the plus sign with Control held. So then we can just deselect the faces that are our base screen, and then we're going to assign the screen border to those. And then we're just going to make the base color black, and looking pretty good. Going to increase the metallic as well. So now we want to bring the metallic down for the base screen and increase the value just a teensy bit. These two materials have to be distinguishable by the eye, but only very subtly, because it's not a great and significant difference. Now it's just all, you can just play around with the materials just a bit more, just to kind of get it to your liking. So I might make the screen maybe a metallic value of 1. I think that's good, but then having the base color a bit less than the border. And I'm just going to take a look now. I think that's looking really nice. Now we're going to create a new material on our edge. So we're going to call this lights. And we're just going to select those loops that we created earlier and assign. And there we have them. So we're going to delete the principled BSDF now because we don't need them. And we're going to add in an emission shader. So we're going to plug the emission into the surface for now. We're not going to end up, we're going to have a bit more. And as you can see, we can actually now affect the emission by animating the strength value of the lights. Next, we're going to add a mix shader in between the output and the emission. And then we're going to add a diffuse BSDF. I'm going to plug the diffuse BSDF into the top mix input node. And this is just going to allow us to have like a really sort of diffuse light. So we're just going to play around with our factor a little bit. And then we're just going to increase the strength. So there, as you can see, we've got this really like diffuse texture that we can now turn on and off the light with the strength of our emission. So it's just a really nice effect, I think. And it's looking pretty good now. We're almost at the end. Now I'm going to go back into my base color and I'm just going to, well, play around with the color value now. So I think I'm going to make this phone purple because purple is the best color. Everyone knows that because it's a combination of blue and red, which are also very good colors. But my favorite purple is a very dark purple. Excellent. Looking good. Next, we're going to want to select our camera, go into edit mode and select the camera face. And we're going to just switch the camera face out to a base screen. So we'll go down to base screen and we will assign that to those faces. And there we have it. And now we're at the very end. I'm going to essentially do something that I should have done at the beginning, and that's make the buttons. So the buttons are very simple. We're just going to add a cube, scale them down, and we're just going to add them into their respective places. And then on the edges, we're going to give them a nice bevel. So always remember to apply the scale when beveling objects that are really small. And then we're going to give them a metallic material. And after that, it was just all about me adding a few extra details here and there, like my logo and things like that, and then setting up the scene with lights and whatnot. But yeah, this tutorial took way longer than I thought it was going to take, mostly in part due to my own fault of the way I create tutorials. Usually I record them and then I put them into an editing software and talk over them. And that's becoming more and more of a hindrance the longer the tutorials are. So I think for the next tutorials, I'm going to really be planning them much more carefully and actually presenting them in a more structured format. Despite this, I hope that you have enjoyed and learnt something in this tutorial. If you have, please give it a like and consider subscribing to this channel for more tutorials on software, art tips, and just other miscellaneous art projects that we'll, get to explore along the way. I thank you for watching up to this point. If you're still with me, this is Hayden Falzon signing out.